When my wife Emily and I bought the house, it felt like a fresh start. It was a quiet neighborhood, lined with old oak trees and neatly trimmed lawns, the kind of place where people waved as they walked their dogs. The house itself had character: white siding, a wraparound porch, and a backyard big enough for weekend barbecues. The seller, an elderly widow named Mrs. Holloway, was kind but distant, eager to move into her assisted living apartment. As we signed the papers, she only said one thing that stuck with me. "It was my husband's dream to finish this place, but life gets in the way, you know?" At the time I thought nothing of it. Now I wish I had asked what she meant. The first night in our new home should have been exciting, but there was something off. The air inside felt stale, heavy, like the house had been waiting too long for someone to return. We were exhausted from moving, so we barely noticed when the overhead lights flickered once or twice. But then there was Murphy, our golden retriever. He had always been easygoing, never one to spook, but that night he flat out refused to go into the guest bedroom. He stood at the threshold, ears pinned back, growling low in his throat. "Maybe he smells something weird," Emily suggested. I nodded, but a tight feeling crept up my spine. Murphy eventually gave up and slinked away, but his unease lingered in the back of my mind. Over the next few days, strange little things kept happening. A box cutter I swore I left on the kitchen counter ended up on the stairs. The bathroom mirror fogged up as if someone had just taken a hot shower, even though no one had used it. And then there were the whispers, soft, distant, just at the edge of hearing. I chalked it up to stress, to being in an unfamiliar space, but at night, lying in bed, I could swear I heard movement downstairs. It wasn't the creaks and groans of an old house settling. It was deliberate, footsteps slow and steady, pacing the hardwood floors. Then, on the 5th day, I met our neighbor, Mr. Langley. He was an older man, probably in his 70s, with sharp blue eyes and a knowing smile. He leaned on the fence, watching as I struggled to untangle a garden hose. "How's the house treating you?" he asked. I hesitated. "It's good, just getting used to it," he nodded, glancing at the windows. "You know, that place was never really finished." I frowned. "What do you mean?" Langley tapped his fingers against the fence post. "The man who built it, Holloway. He had big plans, always working on something, but he died before he could finish." He shrugged. "Maybe that's why it never quite settled." The way he said it, like it was just an offhand thought, sent a shiver down my back. That night I couldn't stop thinking about what Mr. Langley had said. Never quite settled. It was such an odd way to describe a house, but the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. There was something unfinished about this place, something lingering. I tried to push the thought aside as Emily and I got ready for bed. But just as I reached to turn off the bedside lamp, Murphy, who had been curled up at our feet, suddenly lifted his head, ears perked. A low growl rumbled in his chest. My skin prickled. "What is it, buddy?" I whispered. His gaze was locked on the open doorway, staring into the dark hallway beyond. I followed his line of sight, and that's when I saw it. The faintest shift of a shadow, just beyond the threshold. I flicked the light back on, my heart hammering. Nothing, just an empty hallway. But Murphy didn't relax. Neither did I. The next day, Emily left for work early, and I decided to do some unpacking. I found myself standing outside the guest bedroom, the one Murphy refused to enter. The door was slightly ajar, like it was waiting for me. Swallowing my nerves, I stepped inside. The room was plain, just a bed frame and a single dresser against the wall. But something about the air in there felt wrong, heavy, like stepping into a memory that didn't belong to me. I ran my hand along the dresser's surface, and that's when I saw it. Deep scratches along the wood, like someone had been gripping the edges with desperate force. A sudden chill washed over me, and before I could stop myself, I yanked open the top drawer. Inside was a single yellowed envelope tucked in the back corner. My hands trembled as I pulled it out. The name on the front was smudged, barely legible, but the first letters stood out clearly: H. I stared at the envelope for a long time before finally opening it. The paper inside was brittle, handwritten in shaky cursive. It wasn't a letter, not exactly. More like a list. Unfinished thoughts, fragments of sentences. Can't stay here much longer. Something in the walls. She doesn't hear it, but I do. If I don't finish, it won't let me go. The last line was underlined twice. I should have never started. My hands tightened around the paper. A sick feeling crawled into my stomach. Was this written by Mr. Holloway? And if so, what hadn't he finished? That night I told Emily everything. She listened, but I could see the skepticism in her face. Maybe it's just an old note he never got around to throwing away, she said. And the scratches? Could be from moving furniture. I wanted to believe her, I really did. But then, as if to prove me right, the bedroom door, our bedroom door, slammed shut on its own. The walls seemed to groan, a deep resonant sound like the house itself was breathing. Emily and I bolted up, staring at each other, our fear mirrored in the dim glow of the bedside lamp. Then came the sound. A dragging noise, slow and deliberate, coming from the guest bedroom. Emily clutched my arm, her fingers digging into my skin. "Tell me you heard that," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. I nodded, swallowing hard. The dragging sound continued, slow and deliberate, like something heavy was being pulled across the wooden floor. Then, silence. An unbearable, suffocating silence. We sat there frozen, listening. And then Murphy, still lying at the foot of our bed, let out a low whimper. That was enough for me. I grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand, flicked it on, and forced myself to step into the hallway. The air felt colder outside our bedroom, like the temperature had dropped 10 degrees in an instant. My breath came out in shallow, uneven bursts as I crept toward the guest bedroom. The door was still open, the darkness inside thick and impenetrable. I hesitated just outside, my pulse hammering in my ears. Then, gathering every ounce of courage I had, I raised the flashlight and shone it inside. The beam cut through the shadows, sweeping over the empty bed frame, the dresser, the bare walls. Nothing had moved, and yet I could still feel it. That awful crawling sensation, like being watched from just beyond my line of sight. My grip tightened on the flashlight, and then, as if responding to my fear, the closet door creaked open an inch. I sucked in a sharp breath, every instinct screaming at me to leave. But some twisted part of me needed to know. I stepped inside, heart pounding against my ribs, and reached for the closet handle. The wood was unnaturally cold under my fingers. I yanked the door open. The space inside was empty, at least at first glance. But then I saw them. Deep, jagged scratches lining the back wall. Some were fresh, others so old the wood had splintered around them. My stomach turned. These weren't from storage boxes or furniture. They were erratic, frantic, like someone had been trying to claw their way out. That was it. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight, and bolted from the room. Emily was already in the hallway, eyes wide with fear. "We're leaving," I said, my voice shaking. She didn't argue. We grabbed our essentials, wallets, keys, Murphy's leash, and were out of the house in minutes. We drove aimlessly through the neighborhood, neither of us speaking, too shaken to process what had just happened. Finally, we pulled into a gas station parking lot. Emily turned to me, her face pale. "What do we do now?" she asked. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that we couldn't go back. We spent the night in a cheap motel on the outskirts of town. Neither of us slept. Murphy wouldn't stop pacing, ears twitching at every small noise. Emily sat cross-legged on the bed, staring at her phone, probably searching for a rational explanation. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself we weren't losing our minds. Around 3 a.m. she finally spoke. "We need to go back, in the morning." I turned my head to look at her. "Are you serious?" She nodded. "We can't just leave everything there. And we need answers." Morning didn't make the house feel any less wrong. The air was thick, the silence unnatural. It was like stepping back into a place that knew we had tried to escape. We walked through the rooms together, moving quickly, gathering what we could. Nothing had changed, except for the guest bedroom door. It was wide open now. I couldn't bring myself to look inside. "Let's just get our stuff and go," I muttered. Emily agreed. Then, as I was unplugging my laptop from the living room, something caught my eye. A single sheet of paper lying on the coffee table. I hadn't left anything there. My stomach dropped as I picked it up. The handwriting was the same as the note I found in the guest room. I didn't finish it, so now it won't let me leave. My hands trembled. I turned to Emily, holding up the note. Her face went pale. "We need to go. Now." We didn't bother locking the door behind us. We packed up, listed the house within a week, and took a financial loss just to get rid of it. We never told the realtor why. Maybe we should have. Maybe someone else should have been warned. But all I know is this: some things are better left unfinished. I moved into the apartment at the start of fall, excited to finally have a place of my own. It wasn't anything fancy, a one-bedroom unit in an old brick building that had probably seen better days, but the price was unbeatable. I was 24, fresh out of college, and working a job that barely covered rent, so when I found this place listed at way below market rate, I jumped on it without asking too many questions. It smelled faintly of dust and old wood when I first walked in, but it had charm. High ceilings, large windows, a clawfoot tub in the bathroom. The kind of place that made you feel like you were living in some old novel. I even had space for my cat, Milo, who immediately took to curling up on the deep windowsill like he owned the place. The attic door was in the hallway outside my unit, one of those pull-down ladders with a frayed rope handle. The landlord mentioned it was just storage space, nothing to worry about. I barely gave it a second thought. The first few weeks were peaceful. I worked late shifts, came home exhausted, and spent most of my free time unwinding with a beer and some mindless TV. But then little things started happening. Things I could brush off at first. Soft knocking sounds, barely audible, coming from the ceiling at odd hours. Milo would sometimes sit in the middle of the living room, staring at nothing, his tail flicking like he was irritated. I chalked it up to thin walls and old pipes. A place this old was bound to make noise. But the knocking got worse. It didn't happen every night, but when it did, it would come in a steady rhythm. 3 soft knocks, then silence. Sometimes a few minutes would pass before it happened again. Other times, it would keep going, just spaced out enough to make me second-guess whether I was actually hearing it. I even knocked back once, laughing at myself for how ridiculous it was. No response. I told myself it was the neighbor's plumbing, or maybe a bird nesting in the attic, but that creeping sense of unease started to settle in my gut. One night I woke up to Milo hissing at the ceiling. I'd never heard him make that sound before, deep and guttural, like he was warning something to stay away. I sat up in bed, my heart already pounding before I even registered why. The room was cold, colder than it should have been, and then, clear as day, I heard it. The same 3 knocks. But this time, they weren't coming from the attic. They were coming from inside my apartment. I froze, barely breathing, my ears straining in the dark. The knocking had been so clear, so deliberate. like someone tapping their knuckles against the wall just a few feet away. I reached for my phone, fumbling to turn on the flashlight, but the moment the beam cut through the darkness, the apartment was silent again. Milo was still crouched on the bed, ears flattened, his eyes locked on the corner of the ceiling near the closet. My skin prickled as I followed his gaze, but there was nothing there. Just shadows stretching along the walls, shifting slightly as I moved the light. I forced myself to get up, my legs unsteady, and checked the apartment. The door was locked, the windows were shut. There was no sign of anything out of place, but the air felt wrong, thick, heavy, like the apartment itself was holding its breath. I stood in the middle of the living room trying to shake the feeling, but that was when I noticed something else. The attic door. The rope handle was swaying gently, like someone had just let go of it. I hadn't heard it move, hadn't felt a rush of air, but there it was, rocking back and forth like it had been disturbed. I didn't sleep that night. I kept every light on, Milo curled up next to me, though he didn't relax for hours. By morning, I convinced myself I'd imagined most of it. Sleep deprivation, stress, my mind playing tricks on me. I even laughed at myself in the daylight, feeling stupid for letting a few noises get to me. But when I stepped out into the hallway, I stopped cold. The attic door was open, the ladder fully extended. I hadn't heard a sound all night. I stood there, staring up into the dark space above, my stomach twisting. Something had opened it, and it hadn't been me. I told the landlord about it, but he just waved me off. "The attic door doesn't latch properly," he said, barely looking up from his coffee. "Wind probably pulled it down." I wanted to argue, to tell him that wind didn't knock in patterns or make my cat react like he was facing down a predator, but I kept my mouth shut. Maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe there was some logical explanation. I wanted to believe that. I really did. But that night, when I locked my door and tried to put it out of my mind, the knocking started again. And this time, it was louder. I couldn't ignore it anymore. It wasn't the pipes. It wasn't my neighbors. It wasn't the wind. The knocks were measured, insistent, like someone was testing my reaction. I sat frozen on my couch, every muscle in my body tense. 3 knocks. Silence. 3 more. I could feel the sound vibrating through the walls now, as if whatever was making it was inside them, just out of sight. Milo had disappeared under the bed, and I had the overwhelming sensation that I should leave too, that I should grab my keys, walk out, and never come back. But I didn't move. I just stared at the ceiling, waiting. And then it changed. The knocking stopped. For the first time in weeks, I was met with complete silence. I let out a shaky breath, thinking maybe, just maybe, it was over. But then came the sound of something dragging, a slow, deliberate scraping, like furniture being pulled across a wooden floor, except I knew there was nothing up there but dust and forgotten storage. My stomach turned. The sound moved above me, crossing the length of my apartment, stopping right over my bedroom. Then another noise, lighter, softer. Footsteps. I bolted to my feet, my pulse hammering in my ears. No one was supposed to be up there. The landlord had said the attic was empty, just insulation and exposed beams. But I could hear it, someone shifting their weight, the faint creak of wood bending under them. And then, as I stood there in the dark, barely breathing, I heard something worse. Something I still can't explain. A whisper, my name. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed Milo, my phone, my keys, and I was out the door before I could second-guess myself. I drove straight to a friend's place, not caring that it was the middle of the night. I didn't sleep. I barely spoke. When I finally got the courage to go back the next day, everything was exactly as I had left it. Nothing disturbed, no sign of forced entry. But as I stood in my bedroom staring up at the ceiling, I saw it, something small, almost unnoticeable. A tiny gap in the attic panel, just wide enough for an eye to look through. I packed my things that same day. I didn't care about breaking the lease. Didn't care if I had to sleep on a friend's couch for a while. I just knew I couldn't stay there. I kept telling myself there had to be an explanation, something rational that would make it all make sense. But deep down, I knew better. That night, when I had heard my name whispered from the attic, it hadn't sounded distant. It had been close, too close, like someone was crouched just above the ceiling, speaking through the gaps in the wood. Before I left, I made one final mistake. I grabbed a chair, climbed up, and pushed at the attic panel, just enough to peek inside. The space was dim, dust swirling in the beams of light filtering through the vents. At first, I didn't see anything but insulation and wooden rafters. But then, in the farthest corner, I saw it. An old, stained mattress, empty food wrappers, a tattered blanket. Someone had been living up there. And the worst part? Near the edge of the attic, right above my bedroom, were deep scratches in the wood. Not random marks, not animal scratches. They formed words. 3 simple words, carved over and over again. I see you. I slammed the attic panel shut so hard the whole ceiling rattled. I don't remember much after that, just shoving the last of my things into bags and getting the hell out. I never went back. Didn't even bother asking for my deposit. A month later, I found out the next tenant left after only 2 weeks. No explanation. Just gone. I never told anyone the full story until now. But sometimes, even years later, I still wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, ears straining for a sound I pray I'll never hear again. The knocking. When my wife Erin and I bought the house, it felt like we had stumbled upon a hidden gem. It was an old colonial-style home, but well-maintained, tucked into a quiet neighborhood where every house had a well-kept lawn and a porch swing. The previous owners had lived there for over 40 years, an elderly couple who had recently moved to a retirement home. Everything about the house had a warm, lived-in feel, except for one room. It was the only space in the house that felt wrong, completely untouched, like no one had ever set foot inside. No furniture, no scuff marks on the wooden floor, not even a hint of dust on the windowsill. It was unsettling, but we figured the previous owners must have just used it for storage and cleaned it before moving out. One afternoon, while Erin was unpacking in the kitchen, I stepped outside to grab the mail and saw an older woman watering her plants next door. I introduced myself, and after a few minutes of polite small talk, I mentioned how odd it was that one of the rooms had never been used. She gave a small, knowing smile and shrugged. Yeah, they never did. Lived here 40 years, never put so much as a chair in there. I laughed, thinking she was joking, but her face remained neutral. Some houses just have rooms like that, she added before turning back to her garden. The way she said it, like it was just a fact of life, sent a weird shiver down my spine. That first night, we locked the room without thinking much about it. Erin had joked earlier that if any place in the house was haunted, it was definitely that room. But we weren't the superstitious type. Still, something about it made me uneasy, and I didn't like the idea of it standing open while we slept. The next morning, I got up early to make coffee. As I walked down the hall, I stopped dead in my tracks. The door to that room was wide open. I was sure I had locked it the night before, but I figured maybe I hadn't turned the key all the way. I locked it again and brushed it off, but that same night, when we went to bed, Erin made sure to double-check it too. By the third morning, after waking up to the door open yet again, the unease had settled into something heavier. I tested the lock, wiggled the handle, even tried pulling on the door to see if it could pop open on its own. It was solid. There was no way it could be opening by accident. Erin suggested maybe it was an issue with the house settling, but her voice had a slight tremble to it, like she didn't fully believe it herself. That night, I placed a chair in front of the door. If it opened again, I wanted proof. When we woke up, the door was open, and the chair was in the middle of the hallway. That was the moment I stopped trying to rationalize it. Something was wrong with that room. Erin and I didn't talk about it much during the day, but I could tell it was weighing on her too. That night we tried to ignore it, focusing on dinner and watching TV like everything was normal. But when we finally went to bed, sleep didn't come easily. I lay there in the dark, listening. Every creak of the house made my heart pound, but the door stayed shut, at least as far as I knew. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted off. That's when the nightmares started. In my dream, I was standing just outside the room, the open doorway yawning before me like a black hole. I couldn't see inside, but I felt something there, just beyond the threshold. A shape, a presence. It was waiting. The air in the dream was thick, heavy, pressing against my skin like damp fabric. I tried to move, to turn away, but my body wouldn't respond. I was paralyzed, forced to stand there as the darkness inside the room seemed to breathe. Then, just before I woke up, I saw it, pale fingers curling around the edge of the door frame, as if something was about to step out. I bolted upright, gasping for air, and immediately heard Erin do the same. She was sitting up, her hands gripping the blanket, her face pale. "I had a nightmare," she whispered, her voice shaking. My stomach dropped. "Me too," I said. We stared at each other for a long moment before, almost in unison, we turned to look toward the hallway. The door was open. That was the first night, but it wasn't the last. Every night after that, the same thing happened. We locked the door, we went to bed, and we both dreamed of that room. Some nights, the presence just stood there, waiting. Other nights, it moved, closer, inching forward until I could almost see its face. It never fully emerged, but the feeling of being watched, of being stalked even in sleep, became unbearable. We stopped talking about it during the day. We stopped checking the door in the morning. What was the point? It would always be open. It all came to a breaking point one night when Erin woke up screaming. I shot up in bed, heart pounding, and found her sitting rigid, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "It was inside," she choked out. "It was in the room with us." My skin went cold. I reached for the lamp, but before I could turn it on, a sound stopped me. A slow, deliberate creak from the hallway. I didn't want to look, but I had to. Turning my head, I saw it. The door to the unused room wasn't just open. It was wide open, wider than before. The darkness inside felt alive, like it was watching us, waiting for us to do something. I don't know what came over me, but I snapped. I was tired of feeling like a guest in my own house, of waking up in terror every night. Before Erin could stop me, I got out of bed, marched down the hall, and slammed the door shut with all my strength. Then, without thinking, I locked it, grabbed a hammer from the closet, and started nailing the damn thing shut. My hands were shaking, adrenaline surging, but I didn't stop until I had driven half a dozen nails into the frame. Erin just stood there, wide-eyed, watching. When I was done, we both stared at it in silence. That night, we slept. For the first time in weeks, neither of us had nightmares. When we woke up the next morning, the door was still shut. The lock was still in place. The nails still held. The silence in the house felt different, lighter. Neither of us said anything, but I could tell Erin felt it too. Whatever had been in that room, whatever had been waiting, it was gone. Or at least it couldn't reach us anymore. We lived in that house for another 2 years, but we never went near that room again. Eventually, we moved, and when we sold the place, we didn't mention the door, or the nails, or the nightmares. I still think about it sometimes, though. About that presence in the dark. About the way it waited, night after night. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't sealed that door. I don't want to know. But sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I swear I can still feel it watching, waiting. I moved into the house in early spring, right when the last bits of winter were melting away. It was a decent rental, nothing fancy, but it had one feature that sealed the deal for me: a finished basement. As a freelance illustrator, I needed a workspace separate from my bedroom, and the basement was perfect. High ceilings, decent lighting, and most importantly, quiet. At least that's what I thought at first. From the moment I set foot down there, I noticed the air was different. It had that thick, damp feel like the inside of a cave. And there was a smell, subtle but ever-present, earthy, like wet soil after a heavy rain. It didn't seem like a big deal at the time, just something I'd get used to. A few nights in, I started noticing the lights flickering, not just once or twice, but randomly, unpredictably. The basement had recessed ceiling lights, and every so often they'd dim for a second before coming back full strength. I figured it was faulty wiring, maybe something I should bring up with the landlord. But then there were the sounds. At first I thought it was just the house settling, the occasional creak, the odd pop of wood shifting with temperature changes. But this was different. It was softer, almost rhythmic. A faint scraping sound, like something dragging lightly against the floorboards beneath my feet. I didn't want to overthink it. Houses make noises. That's just how it is. But the more time I spent in the basement, the harder it became to ignore. It wasn't just the scraping. Sometimes it was a distant, muffled thud, like something shifting deep underground. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind filling in gaps, turning ordinary noises into something sinister. But I kept catching myself holding my breath, waiting for the next sound. It wasn't constant, but when it happened, I felt it in my chest, like a faint vibration running through the floor. One evening, after another round of flickering lights, I finally decided to ask the landlord about it. Her name was Ms. Carter, a woman in her late 50s with a sharp, no-nonsense demeanor. I called her and casually brought up the basement issues: the lights, the sounds, the strange smell. She listened in silence, and for a moment I thought the call had dropped. Then she let out a long sigh and said, "You're better off not going down there after dark." Her voice was steady, but there was something in the way she said it that sent a chill up my spine. I let out a nervous chuckle, thinking she was joking, but she didn't laugh. "Ms. Carter, what do you mean by that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. She hesitated again, then said, "Just listen to me. Keep the basement door shut at night. And if you hear anything, don't go looking for it." That was the end of the conversation. She wouldn't say more. I hung up, my fingers tightening around my phone. It was one thing to have a weird basement, but when the person who owns the house tells you not to go down there at night, it does something to your head. Makes the shadows seem darker, the air feel heavier. That night I locked the basement door before heading to bed. I told myself I was just being cautious, that it was nothing serious, but deep down, I felt uneasy. Around 2 a.m. I woke up to something faint. So faint I almost convinced myself I imagined it. A slow, deliberate dragging noise coming from below. It wasn't just a single scrape this time. It went on for minutes. A low, shuffling sound, like something shifting just beneath the basement floor. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, heart pounding. I wanted to believe it was my imagination, but then I heard it. A sharp, deliberate knock. 3 times, coming from the basement door. I froze. My body locked up, my breath caught in my throat. My first instinct was to check the front door to see if someone had broken in. But I knew better. The knock hadn't come from outside. It came from inside the basement. My mind raced for a logical explanation. Pipes? Maybe the house settling in a really weird way? but deep down, I knew. That was a knock, a deliberate, measured knock. I stayed in bed, eyes glued to my bedroom door, waiting, listening. The house was silent now. Too silent. Like it was holding its breath with me. I barely slept the rest of the night. The next morning I stood in front of the basement door, debating whether I should even open it. When I finally did, everything looked the same. The lights worked. My workspace was untouched. But the smell was stronger, richer, like the soil had been disturbed. I crouched down, pressing my palm against the floor. It felt warmer, almost like body heat radiating up from below. That was the moment I decided I needed to know what was under there. I spent the afternoon researching the house, trying to find anything that might explain what was happening. The records were sparse, but I found something unsettling. The property had changed owners multiple times over the last few decades, most tenants leaving after only a year or two. No official complaints, no reports of anything unusual, just a pattern of people moving out faster than expected. That didn't sit right with me. That night, before locking the basement door, I placed a glass of water on the floor near the stairs. A test. If something was shifting under there, I'd see the ripples. At around 3 a.m. I woke up again, this time to a deep, guttural groan, like something straining beneath the foundation. I stayed in bed, gripping the sheets, my pulse hammering in my ears. Then, a sound I'll never forget. The scraping turned into scratching. Slow, deliberate, like nails raking against wood. My entire body broke into a cold sweat. I knew, without a doubt, that something was trying to get out. Gathering every ounce of courage, I grabbed a flashlight and stepped toward the basement door. My hands shook as I turned the knob, heart pounding in my chest. The moment I cracked the door open, the smell hit me in full force. Thick, suffocating, like damp, rotting earth. I aimed my flashlight down the stairs. The water glass was shattered. But what made my stomach drop was the floor itself. There were deep, jagged grooves in the wood, like something had clawed its way up from below. My breath hitched. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and did the only thing that made sense in that moment. I packed a bag and left. I didn't care about my deposit. I didn't care about the lease. Whatever was under that basement floor wanted out, and I wasn't going to be the one to let it. I moved out the next morning, never looked back. I don't know what was buried beneath that house, and I never want to find out. But sometimes, late at night when I'm lying in bed in my new place, I swear I can still hear it, the slow, rhythmic scraping just beneath the floor. When my wife, Emily, and I moved into our new home, we were thrilled. It was our first real house. No more cramped apartments, no more noisy neighbors stomping above us. The place was old but charming, with wooden floors that creaked under our steps, and a fireplace in the living room that made it feel cozy. We spent the first few days unpacking, making the space our own. It wasn't until our third night that we noticed the safe in the master bedroom closet. It was huge, made of thick steel and bolted to the floor. Neither the previous owners nor the real estate agent had mentioned it. The closet itself was deep, the kind that swallows light, and the safe sat there, half hidden in the shadows, like it had been forgotten for decades. At first we laughed about it, tossing around theories about what might be inside. Old cash, secret documents, maybe even something valuable enough to change our lives. "What if it's full of gold bars?" Emily joked, nudging me. I grinned, running my fingers over the combination dial, which was worn smooth from years of use. "Or something more interesting," I said with a smirk. We tried a few random numbers, but the lock didn't budge. Eventually we moved on, figuring we'd deal with it later. But that night, just as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard something. A faint whisper, so quiet I almost convinced myself I imagined it. I turned toward Emily, but she was already asleep, her slow, steady breathing filling the room. The next few nights the noises continued. Sometimes it was just a soft rustling sound, like fabric shifting in the closet. Other times it was more distinct, whispered words just on the edge of comprehension. I'd lie there, frozen, listening, trying to make sense of it. Emily didn't seem to notice at first, but then, a few nights later, she shook me awake. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice tight with fear. I listened, and sure enough, the bedroom door was rattling, just slightly, like someone was testing the handle from the other side. My heart pounded as I sat up, straining to hear. Then it stopped. We checked the house, but everything was exactly as we left it. No windows open, no signs of forced entry. The breaking point came when we saw the safe's dial moving on its own. It was late, past midnight, and I had just gotten up to use the bathroom. As I passed the closet, I heard a faint clicking sound, like metal shifting against metal. I stopped, heart hammering, and slowly pushed the door open. The safe was right where it always was, but the combination dial was spinning, slowly, deliberately, as if unseen fingers were turning it. I stared, too scared to breathe. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The room fell into silence, thick and suffocating. I backed away, my mind racing with possibilities. None of them good. Emily didn't believe me at first. When I shook her awake and told her what I saw, she just mumbled something about me dreaming and rolled over. But the next night, she saw it too. We were both in bed, barely speaking, tension thick in the air. The closet door was slightly ajar, just as we had left it, and in the dim light from the hallway we both saw the dial move. It wasn't fast. It turned slowly, one click at a time, as if something inside was trying to unlock it. Emily let out a sharp breath and gripped my arm so hard it hurt. "We need to get rid of that thing," she whispered. I nodded, but neither of us moved. The next morning, we decided we'd call a locksmith. But before we could, something even stranger happened. As I was brushing my teeth, Emily called me into the bedroom, her voice shaking. She was standing in front of the closet, pointing at the floor. There were scratches in the wood, deep, jagged gouges leading from the safe to the closet door, like something had tried to claw its way out. I knelt down, running my fingers over the marks. They were fresh. The thought sent a shiver down my spine. "How did we not hear this?" I muttered. Emily didn't answer. She just wrapped her arms around herself and stared at the safe, like it might lunge at her. That afternoon, I did what any sane person would do. I tried to move the damn thing out of the house. I grabbed my tools, thinking I could unbolt it from the floor, but the moment I touched it, a chill ran up my arm. Not just cold, something worse, something that made my skin crawl. I yanked my hand back, shaking it off like I had just touched something rotten. "Nope," I muttered, stepping away. Emily watched from the doorway, her arms crossed tightly. "We have to open it," she finally said. I turned to her, expecting fear in her eyes, but instead I saw something else: determination. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the desperate need to end whatever this was, but either way, I knew she was right. That night, I left my phone recording in front of the closet while we slept. I wasn't sure what I expected, maybe just some faint sounds, but when I played it back the next morning, my blood ran cold. The first hour was nothing but silence. Then, just past 3 a.m., a faint clicking sound began, like the dial turning. That alone would have been bad enough, but then came the whispering. It wasn't just one voice. It was multiple, overlapping, urgent, like they were arguing or pleading. And then, right before the recording cut off, one word came through, clear as day, spoken in a voice that didn't belong to either of us. "Open." Emily and I didn't speak for a long time after listening to that recording. The air in the room felt heavier, like the house itself was waiting for us to make a move. Finally, she whispered, "We have to open it." I wanted to argue, to say that whatever was inside was locked away for a reason. But deep down, I knew she was right. We couldn't live like this, afraid of our own home, jumping at every sound. So against every bit of common sense, we called a locksmith. We didn't tell him everything, just that we had found an old safe and needed it opened. The guy, a middle-aged man named Rick, showed up the next morning, completely unaware of what he was walking into. The moment Rick stepped into the closet, he hesitated. "Man, this thing's old," he muttered, running his fingers over the metal. "Might take a while." He set up his tools and we stood behind him, barely breathing. As he worked, the house felt unnaturally silent, like it was listening. Then, after what felt like hours but was probably just minutes, there was a heavy click. The lock disengaged. Rick exhaled and stepped back. "There you go," he said, giving the handle a final tug. "Should open just fi—" He stopped mid-sentence. His face went pale. We followed his gaze to the safe door, which had cracked open just an inch. A low, guttural whisper slipped through the gap. Rick backed away so fast he nearly tripped over his own feet. "Nope," he said, grabbing his tools and practically running out the door. Emily and I stood frozen. The whispering grew louder, not like a voice but like the sound of wind forcing itself through a narrow space. The closet light flickered, and suddenly, a foul stench filled the room, like decay, old and wet. Then the door creaked open just a little more, revealing darkness inside. Not empty darkness, thick, pulsing, moving darkness. It was the first and only time in my life I felt something truly wrong, something unnatural. Without thinking, I lunged forward and slammed the safe shut, twisting the dial with shaking hands. The second it locked, the whispering stopped. The air cleared, the stench vanished, and the house felt normal again, like it had just let out a breath it had been holding. Emily and I looked at each other, both knowing we would never open that thing again. The next day, we had the closet sealed shut. Not just locked, sealed. Drywall, nails, paint, everything. We never spoke about it again. That was 2 years ago. Sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet, I swear I can hear it. The faintest click of a dial turning, just on the other side of the wall. When I moved into the house, I didn't think much about the locked door at the end of the hallway. The landlord, an older guy named Mr. Harris, waved it off like it was nothing. "Just an old storage room," he had said, barely looking at it. "Been sealed off for years. I'll send someone to check it out eventually." The house was cheap, and I needed a place fast, so I didn't push it. Besides, it wasn't like I needed the extra space. The place was small, just a one-bedroom rental in a quiet neighborhood. But it was enough for me. After a nasty breakup and leaving behind a shared apartment, I just wanted somewhere I could be alone. At first, I barely noticed the door. It was plain, painted the same dull off-white as the rest of the walls, blending in like an afterthought. No knob, just a tarnished brass handle that didn't turn. I even tried it once, just out of curiosity, but it wouldn't budge. The landlord had said it was locked from the inside, which didn't make sense to me. If no one had been in there for years, why would it be locked at all? I brushed it off. People seal up old rooms all the time. Maybe there was mold, or it was just a structural thing. The first time I noticed something was off, I was half asleep. It must have been around 2 in the morning, and I was making my usual trip to the kitchen for water. As I passed the hallway, I saw it, the faintest sliver of light spilling from under the door. It wasn't much, just a thin golden line cutting through the darkness, but it was enough to make me stop in my tracks. I stood there for a second, heart pounding, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was light from the street bleeding in somehow? But no, The hallway had no windows. And besides, the light wasn't cold or flickering like a street lamp. It was warm, soft, like a lamp left on inside. I should have ignored it. I should have gone back to bed, but instead, I took a step closer. I don't know why. Just that deep, gnawing curiosity that comes when something doesn't make sense. I leaned in, pressing my ear against the wood, holding my breath. Silence. For a long moment, nothing but the sound of my own pulse. And then, so faint I almost missed it, a shift, a rustling, like fabric moving. My breath hitched, and I jerked back. My first thought was that there was someone in there. That was impossible, right? The door was locked. The room had been abandoned for years. But as I stood there staring at that sliver of golden light, I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever, or whatever, was inside was waiting. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the door creaking open, some shadow slipping out, standing at the foot of my bed. It was stupid, I knew that, but the feeling wouldn't go away. The next morning I checked the door again. No light, no sound, just an ordinary locked door. Maybe I had been half dreaming, still groggy from sleep. That's what I told myself anyway. But as the days passed, the feeling that something was off only got stronger. Little things started happening. I'd wake up and find the hallway light flicked on, even though I was sure I had turned it off before bed. Once I came home from work and swore I smelled something faintly sweet, like old perfume, lingering near the door. Then came the knocking. It started quietly, a soft, rhythmic tap, 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 just as I was drifting off to sleep. I shot up in bed, heart hammering. It wasn't the sound of a pipe or the house settling. It was deliberate, human. I forced myself to stay still, ears straining in the dark. Tap, tap, a pause, then tap, tap again. Not loud, but insistent, like someone was testing to see if I'd respond. I lay there paralyzed, staring at the ceiling. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I couldn't hear footsteps, couldn't hear anyone moving away. Just that heavy, unnatural quiet pressing in on me. By morning, I had convinced myself I imagined it. Stress, exhaustion, my mind playing tricks. But that night, it happened again. And the next. Always around the same time. Somewhere past midnight, never lasting more than a few minutes. I stopped sleeping properly. I'd lie awake, staring at my bedroom door, waiting. Every night, the same tapping. I thought about recording it, proving to myself that I wasn't crazy. But the idea of playing it back, of hearing the sound confirmed, terrified me. If I acknowledged it, if I gave it attention, I felt like it would get worse. And then, one night, something changed. I had left a glass of water on the kitchen counter before bed, just like I always did. When I woke up, it was gone. Not spilled, not knocked over. Gone. I searched everywhere, convinced I had just misplaced it. But as I walked past the locked door, my stomach dropped. The glass was sitting there, right in front of it, perfectly centered. The water inside was still half full. My hands were shaking as I picked it up. It was ice cold, like it had just come from the fridge. That was the moment I realized I wasn't just imagining things. Someone, something, was in there, and it knew I had noticed. I thought about calling the landlord, demanding he open the damn door, but I already knew what he'd say. He'd brush it off, tell me it was nothing, maybe even laugh at me. So I did the next best thing. I taped the door shut. It felt ridiculous, but I needed to know if it was being opened. I pressed long strips of duct tape along the edges, sealing every gap. If that door so much as budged, I would see it. That night, I barely slept. Every noise, every creak of the house sent my pulse racing. But the knocking didn't come. No rustling, no tapping. Just silence. When morning came, I almost laughed at myself. Maybe that was all I needed, to set a boundary, to show whatever was in there that I wasn't playing along. But when I stepped into the hallway, my stomach dropped. The tape was gone. Not peeled back or torn. Gone. Like it had never been there. The door sat just as it always had, perfectly still, perfectly normal. But I knew better. I packed a bag that afternoon. I told myself I was just going to crash at a motel for a night or two, clear my head. But the truth was, I wasn't coming back. As I grabbed my keys, I hesitated, my eyes drifting to the door one last time. And then, as if it had been waiting for me to look, I saw it, just for a second. The handle, it turned. Not all the way. Just enough. A slow, deliberate movement, like a finger pressed against someone's lips, telling them to keep quiet. I left, and never went back. I called the landlord from the road, told him I was moving out immediately. He barely reacted, like he'd expected it. Maybe he had. I don't know what's behind that door, and I don't want to. But sometimes, in the dead of night, when the house I live in now is quiet, I swear I hear it. That soft, rhythmic tap, 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 waiting for me to answer.